Ludzie są zmęczeni, ludzie chcą pokoju. Czy możesz mi pokazać, gdzie...
We begin the day, look back almost exactly 4 years back to the night Russia unleashed its full-scale invasion on Ukraine. In the early hours of February 24th of 2022, Russian forces, which had been building up on Ukraine's borders, crossed into the country and began moving toward the capital, Kyiv. Many at the time thought it would only be a matter of days or weeks before Russia had full control over Ukraine. 4 years later, the front line is largely frozen, with Russian forces occupying some 20% of eastern and southern Ukraine. But today, one of Ukraine's top commanders said Kyiv had managed to restore control over some 400 square kilometers in recent weeks. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz noted those gains in a speech he gave today at an anniversary event in Berlin.
February saw astonishing territorial gains by the Ukrainian defenses, and the Russian economy is creaking under the weight of sanctions and of warfare, more than we may sometimes surmise from our own media coverage here.
So where do things stand now after 4 years of war? I'm joined by Justin Crump, an intelligence and security analyst we've spoken to many, many times over the past 4 years. He's the founder and CEO of the think tank Sibylline. Good to see you, Justin. Now, we heard the German Chancellor there saying Ukraine was performing better on the battlefield than is often reported, and by the sound of it, than he did expect. Do you agree with his assessment, though?
I do. I think Ukraine's done very well to stay in the fight for 4 years, and very well to largely have managed to freeze the front lines over the last few years against increasing Russian pressure. Obviously, we know the Russians have succeeded in grinding forward slowly in a number of places, but nonetheless, Ukrainians have done very well to hold as much ground as they have done, and that's taken a huge amount of effort. So I think that it does get a little bit lost in a lot of the analysis going on at the moment, potentially partly because people remember after about 6 months the war in Ukraine took back large swathes of territory against Russia, and of course we've not seen manoeuvres like that for quite some time. But nonetheless, Ukraine is doing well to stay in the fight, doing well to hold the front lines.
What's their secret? How do they manage to hold out for this long?
I mean, part of it is because Ukraine doesn't really have a choice. The Ukrainians are fighting for their homes, fighting for their land, and as Putin has said, where a Russian soldier treads, that is Russia. So they very clearly understand that if they cede any ground, it'll probably be lost forever. So that certainly focuses their minds. They've also taken a lot of advantage of new technologies, of improvising. We've seen that tactically, we've seen that with the use of drones, and particularly actually at sea, where Ukraine with no navy has largely defeated the Black Sea Fleet, which is very, very notable indeed. But the same sort of use being made of drones on land, and ways to try and restore the balance of the Ukrainians. But really, fundamentally, it's the fact that they are fighting for their land, and Russia is not.
Looking at the conflict as a whole, to what extent would you say the past 4 years have changed how we think about modern warfare?
I think some of the lessons have been ones we expected. For example, I think the utility of drones is widely understood but hadn't been practiced on the scale we've seen, particularly in the form of smaller drones, commercial drones as weapons directly. Those are things that we hadn't seen in previous conflicts. But some of the lessons remain the same. The difficulty of taking ground once the front line goes static is something we've seen before, for example, in Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, where that front line barely moved. And we've also seen the consequences of economic warfare, the way that you then see the targeting that Russia has undertaken change over time and to put pressure on the civilian population. Again, not new, but I think lessons there. And some aspects of hybrid warfare that we talk about a lot were actually not being seen to be particularly effective in Ukraine. For example, the information warfare and the cyber aspects, it remains very much a battlefield conflict. So, as always, mixed lessons. Some things are new, some things reinforce things we understood. But I mean, what it has shown us is the nature of warfare remains unchanging.
Ukraine's allies have, of course, been unable to stop Putin. Besides military support for Ukraine, sanctions have been their main tool to pressure the Kremlin. Why has that not been enough?
I mean, it certainly made life more difficult for Russia, but of course, Putin further control of the country. It's a population that feels like it doesn't really have a choice or a say politically. They're quite resigned to doing what the leader says and what the government says in Russia. But, for example, VAT rate's up another 2%. The economy in Russia clearly not doing brilliantly well. And although Russia's done pretty well to keep going against the sort of pressure it's had, obviously it gradually takes its toll. And where Russia's been effective in some ways is getting troops and volunteers from, if you like, less popular regions of Russia, keeping things away from the major cities where Putin cares the most. But of course, gradually that pressure is coming home to roost even with that population. So it has had an effect, but I would characterize most of what we've done for Ukraine collectively in the West as not quite enough, not quite on time. But it's done a lot to keep them in the fight. It's done a lot to reduce pressure Russia could have brought to bear. And I think now is the time that we have to see, can this effort be maintained? Can Ukraine be given enough to finally force the Russians into better concessions than they've offered so far?
Yeah, let's take a look at how these alliances have shifted, specifically in the past year since Donald Trump returned to the White House. Kyiv has become significantly more dependent on Europe. In your opinion, have European leaders risen to the occasion, or is it still a matter of life or death for Ukraine to stay in the U.S.'s good graces?
I mean, European leaders, I think, have done more initially than Putin expected. I think the Russians are quite...
0, 7, 4, 6, 6, 3, 9, 0, 5, 3, 6.
The immediate reaction to the invasion, partly because European leaders, particularly in France and Germany, I think felt very let down that Putin had assured them that he wouldn't attack. The US, the UK and NATO collectively said he would, and he did. So the European reaction was quite strong initially, and then sort of lagged, and then the US took a lot more effort. But really, since Trump came into the White House, the US effort has been negligible. And despite, I think, a lot of behind-the-scenes effort by US forces, Europe has taken the brunt and has kept Ukraine in the fight for the last year. So it shows it can be done. But it is, it's an intense effort. And of course, spending on Ukraine is money that can't be spent on European defence in the home nations. We can't rebuild our own forces with money that's gone to Ukraine. The big debate being, are we better off making sure that Ukraine wins or at least gets a just peace? Or do we need to prepare for what may come next from Russia, which remains a very clear long-term threat? Zelensky's reinforced that himself in the last 24 hours in the speeches he's given. I think he's correct in that. So that's a big question mark for Europe. It has picked up the slack. Is it committed to remain doing so? I think currently yes. The view being that there's probably another year of fighting. Certainly through this summer, Russia's mobilised its reserves to that, so they'll almost certainly use them. And so there's a lot to play for while negotiations hopefully take place in the background.
Let's look at these negotiations. U.S. President Trump wanted to end the war on day one of his presidency, his second presidency. You and I were here today because that obviously did not happen. The efforts are still underway. Do you see these peace negotiations leading to anything resembling the just peace Ukraine is hoping for?
I mean, it is a process in these situations. Russia feels they can press harder and get more. As I said earlier, I think the Russians feel that if they own a piece of land, once their soldiers are trodden on it, that's going to be theirs. Ukraine obviously has a different view. But the real sticking point is the just peace aspect. What are the guarantees for Ukraine in the long term? If Ukraine does have to cede territory that Russia won't give up once it's taken it, and of course Russia's passed laws internally to make the territory they've taken now Russian territory. What does Ukraine get in return? Does this finish, or is it just a repeat of what we saw in the various pieces since 2014 that were all broken? And indeed going all the way back to Budapest and the original agreement for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons in order to not be attacked by Russia and others. So there's a long history of truces being broken for Ukraine, and that's the thing that they're most concerned with. But of course, adequate security guarantee is probably not acceptable to Russia. So until someone's absolutely forced to accept things they don't want to accept, the process will carry on. But the battle on the land and sea and air will also carry on as all sides try and either hold the line in Ukraine's case or take more territory, put more pressure on in the case of Russia's.
The security analyst and Civilian CEO Justin Crump, thank you so much for today, and of course for sharing your expertise with us in the past. It's always great to get your insights on the show. Russia's war on Ukraine has, of course, taken a tremendous human toll on both sides. Exact casualty numbers are hard to come by, but it's clear that practically all Ukrainians' lives have been affected by 4 years of war. DW's Washington correspondent Misha Kumadovsky met one young survivor of a Russian attack who traveled to the U.S. Capitol to lobby for continued American support for Ukraine.
One face of Russian atrocities in Ukraine, 11-year-old Roman Alexiev. In 2022, a missile struck the hospital where he and his mother were staying. She died under the rubble. Roman suffered burn